What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
Welcome, everyone, to Reframing the Narrative, Episode 16. And this episode we're entitling Heroes or Zeros. And there's a very specific intention to this discussion. And a lot of it has to do with some offline conversations Jake and I have had about people who've been lifted up and kind of venerated in rare air in people's minds of being superhuman in some way or something to look up to, whether that be government, whether that be so-called freedom fighters or truth leaders, or be that people in history, famous icons of health, as anyone who's looked at the Central Texas rabbit hole recently will have seen. I've got some information that definitely sheds light on Pasteur, who was one of those, and that's just one small example. But, really wanted to get people thinking about why we venerate these people in the first place and whether we really need heroes at all. Spoiler alert, we don't, but we're going to talk about that. So before we go any further, Jake, great to see you again. How have you been?
Great to be back with you, PJ, and welcome back, everyone. I've been okay. Preparing for a road trip this weekend as part of my occupation, and I'm fortunate enough not to be in a cubicle to do it. As far as our topic of the day goes, I think maybe some people might go their entire lives without really coming to the realization that they don't need a hero, of any sort, and that can be a hard one type of knowledge and a hard one lesson to learn. But I think both of us have through observation and experience, both learned that we really don't need heroes in our lives. And I think one big theme that we've been stressing throughout all previous 15 episodes of Reframing the Narrative is the traps that are set out there that we can fall into. And some of them are intentional. Some of them just might happen naturally. You just might venerate somebody or something because of a natural tendency. We tend to want to put something above us and ahead of us that's bigger than us, that we might find maybe unreachable or better, and aspire to be like them or to learn from them or be inspired by them. And if it's a person, they're fallible, they're human, and they probably, if we all know the term skeletons in the closet. If you really looked at anybody's life under a microscope, there's probably something that in this day and age would be a cancelable offense in anybody's back history. And I think of all the ways that I could be canceled just in the public realm for thoughts I have, or maybe things that I might have done in the past, but that would be really unfair. But would it be fair to hold me up to begin with? Maybe that's something to examine. And maybe that's why I think getting to this whole idea of heroes, why we see a tendency for some celebrities and superstar athletes, people that are in the spotlight, to really kind of treat people maybe not like they're above them, but they treat the veneration in a very spiteful way. And I think sometimes that could be an outgrowth of them feeling themselves superior to others. But I think on the flip side, it could come from a place of humility where people are just like, I'm just a dude. I put my pants on one pant leg at a time. My shit stinks the same as everybody else's. I'm just as fallible as everyone else. Why must you worship me? And I think that gives them license to feel like they can, in some respects, like, you're kind of stupid for You're like a useless eater for worshiping me. So that's a dynamic that's afoot with this hero worship and celebrity worship that we get into. And I didn't expect to go in that direction. So where do you want to take it, PJ?
Well, I think that you brought up a lot of good examples, and obviously one that we've talked about on our broadcast before is, and I definitely saw witness to it, or I was witness to it just in the past couple of days in family gatherings. How people still hold up politicians, and DJT is an example, red hair man, whatever you want to call him, and then RFK is another favorite one. And it's interesting to me that he already showed his true colors, which I think many of us have suspected him as being a plant in many ways. But he was all against pokes in the arm, and then suddenly he gets into this office and he's like, well, there's some that are still good, and we still need them. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I think he took a few people for a ride who didn't figure it out already. But it's interesting now they've got him fighting against artificial food dyes, and that's sort of a throwing a bone to people so that they can say, oh, well, this guy's really our champion for making sure people are healthy. So it's just, as you say, one of those traps that's out there for people to fall into. But you brought up athletes, and of course many people look up to famous athletes, and as you say, they're just as human as us. And it made me think about one great example is Michael Jordan. Many still consider him one of the best basketball players ever. And whether that's true or not, or whether it's LeBron or whoever your favorite person is, you could look at Michael Jordan, you could look at LeBron, and look at their skeletons, or that in many cases are not so hidden, and go, why are we holding this person up in this high esteem? And in Michael Jordan's case, I mean, there's a lot of suspicion around what it took him to fully get in the club, and the timing of his father's death before he really blew up in the public eye. And many people might be familiar with the concept that for you to really get famous, you have to sacrifice a family member or something to that effect. And there's many examples of that. I'm sure we could brainstorm ones we've heard of, but that's just an example of what did it cost Michael Jordan to get into the club, and to have all of his barriers removed to excel and show everyone his greatness, and whether that greatness was real or partially real. I think as many people dig into deeper levels of truth, they probably discover that even pro sports are um, not entirely by chance or completely fair. In many cases, the outcomes are predetermined in many cases. So all that is to say, whether it's a politician, an athlete, freedom fighter, and we'll talk about some examples there. This runs across the gamut, and I think it's, I think you bring up a good point that many people are like, well, how could I ever do something so great? Because that's sort of, they've been conditioned. They look on their TV and they see these people shown as superhuman, and you just go, well, I'm just a guy, as you say. But how superhuman are these people really? If you poke at the facade, would it fall to pieces? I think in many cases you'd see that they're just as human as us. And furthermore, if you read some of the interviews from famous people, and the one that just sticks out in my mind, I remember years ago reading something in like Rolling Stone about Johnny Depp, and him lamenting that he would love to give up his fame if he could, that like it's impossible for him to live a normal person's life, and just to go to a restaurant, sneaking in a back door and having to hide from the public. Like, it's sort of like the dog chasing the ambulance. They're like, once they catch the ambulance, they don't really know whether they wanted it in the first place or what to do with it. And so that's just another aspect of all this. Like, there's no reason to hold these people up and feel like they're doing something better than you could do. And also linking in a discussion we had a couple weeks ago about everyone has human potential, and there's so much we can do with our time and talents if we really focus them and remove the distractions in our lives.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point about just focusing outside ourselves rather than on what we could do to really develop our potential. What I think where we're getting at is that this all kind of holds us down and keeps us from knowing ourselves and becoming the person that we're meant to be. And it's funny you mentioned athletes. By the way, MJ was the best NBA player ever, no debate at all. And that's final story. But as far as being a human being, yeah, he had a serious gambling addiction, probably got involved with the wrong people as a result. And maybe his father was sacrificed as a result, as a consequence. And that was part of the mistakes he made. And he has to live with that. And I don't know what it's like for him, the torment of his soul to have to be in that kind of situation. And I don't know the facts as far as that goes, but just reflecting on athletes, I've been an athlete, and the difference between me and the best athletes was natural talent. I put in the same amount of work. I had the same knowledge. I had the same gear or about the same level of coaching and everything that they did, but it just came natural to them. I knew a guy who was a smoker and was young and just was invited, almost dared to take part in a marathon. And he just literally like got up off the couch and ran a sub 3 hour marathon with no training. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So, just a little bit of training and that guy was winning ultra marathons. He quit smoking, quit drinking, and was very disciplined about his diet and his training. And he became a champion endurance runner. But he had that natural ability. I would train to my maximum ability and get the results that he did maybe a few months in his running career, going sub 3 in the marathon. And then thinking back to like the best athletes growing up in school and the ones that were, the most popular in school, they were just talented athletes. If you examined how they were as human beings, they'd be below average as far as who I would want to associate with or contributing in other ways other than on the court or the field or whatever venue they competed in. So that, I think, just being aware of that has kept me from going too far in really investing in especially sports figures. And I never really had too many illusions about figures in other areas. But definitely, I think a trap that people fall into is the idea that we need outside saviors, and we need people to not just entertain us, but to tell us how things are or what to do. And part of that is just because we're on this treadmill. We're just on this whole chase after mammon and trying to make a living. And then we get home, and this is the typical, maybe not in the internet age as much as in the past, but we'd get home and we'd turn on the 3 channels that were available to us. And we didn't have the energy or the impetus to really use our brains to try and learn how the world really works or what is going on. And so we just literally consented. I think this is psychically a very important point. We just said, okay, tell me how it is. And if you think back to Walter Cronkite's sign off, it was, and that's the way it is. They were literally telling you, like, mind control. This is what you should believe, what I just told you for the last hour on the evening news. So yeah, that's the news, that's authority, and it's all the same. We're basically just consenting to outsourcing our sovereignty and development of our innate abilities and our potential.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, as it's been a theme in some of the topics we've covered in this podcast so far, just the idea of the tell lie vision and its influence on the world that we live in. And you brought up the three channels, and if you really think about it, what is that trying to tell us? It's channeling, right? There's a spiritual aspect as well as um, an actual mind control aspect, which the mind control part, they also tell you it's a program. You are being programmed, right? And so the part of that is to get people in that trance state and then for them to be suggestive to a variety of messages, overt and subliminal, and then also to start planting the seeds for ways people can either be distracted or corrupted in some way. And part of that corruption, I think, is hero worship. And instead of, as you had said, figuring out how I personally can grow in some way, I'm watching somebody do something or holding them up in some esteem and going, well, I could never do that. Sort of like the example that I brought up recently. I've heard people say so many times in my life, oh, I always wanted to play guitar. I wish I'd learned that. And it's like, what's stopping you? Your arms look like they're working fine. You're able to hold a conversation. Do it. Like, what's stopping you? But taking the conversation a slightly different direction and talking about the traps, we've talked about this before in the past about in 2020 and everything that happened around that, and how there were a number of I would say bigger names of people that many of us found, and then people who suddenly went viral and had big audiences. And I just actually became aware of one of them, and I'll just start with this name and just as an example. But for my most recent video about Pasteur, I borrowed heavily from the hard work that Mike Stone from Virology has done. And looking through some of his past work, I ran into an article called Skyfall, and it was about Chris Sky. Now, for those of you who may recall or maybe aren't familiar with this particular gentleman, he had kind of come about as a Canadian voice against masking and some of the mandates that were happening. And he was sort of a buff guy who had naturally dark hair and like a big blonde streak in the middle. And he went from being a no one to suddenly internet fame, and he was one of the people being shared around. And so he was like supposedly a freedom fighter, but long story short, Mike Stone got pulled into conversations online with him where he was basically saying, well, I never believed in CV19 as a real um, bug, I'll say, for purposes of platforms, but then he was a proponent of all these other ones being real, and people were asking Mike Stone to get involved. And despite his better judgment, he got pulled that direction and started a debate with Chris Sky. And quickly into that series of events, once Chris Sky's lack of knowledge was exposed through one or two information exchanges, Chris Sky had reverted to basically name calling and being very offensive and not really posing a real argument to the points that Mike Stone was bringing up. And then furthermore, Mike Stone had looked into Chris Guy's background to discover that his father was like a rich real estate guy, and clearly Chris Guy's meteoric rise to fame was not organic. He had a lot of likely financial backing behind him, and who knows what else. But he's just an example of someone who was planted to be one of those controlled voices against the establishment that when you really look at him closely, it's like, maybe that's someone that we shouldn't have thought was one of our heroes back then. And hopefully some people have come to the same realization. Now, I can't say that I really thought about that guy since no later than, let's say, 2021. But certainly he's found himself in different internet circles now and exposing himself as less than knowledgeable, at least on the subject of health matters. And that was kind of how he made his claim to fame. And yeah, I think it's just an instructive lesson that, as you said earlier, Jake, these are just people. And in many cases, they get put on the big stage prematurely or for a particular reason. And it just, you know, long story short, we don't really need heroes to begin with. But if you're going to hold someone in high esteem, you should probably know more about them than just they put a few videos that went viral quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody with a good ability at Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro, or the ability to hire somebody to put together a good video doesn't mean they're a good person, or it's just somebody who's got a really good skill, and it doesn't mean that we need to venerate the whole person. I think there's the phrase, worship the creation rather than the creator. That can be a mistake, and it's kind of the same here. You're worshiping the person rather than the gift, and worship is the wrong word because we shouldn't be worshiping other people at all. We don't usually use that term. We do use like look up to or love or things like that to talk about heroes. We do talk about hero worship, but normally it's not the first term that comes to mind. But actually in another language, in Mandarin Chinese, you would say, I worship this superstar, this celebrity. That's the term that they use, 崇拜. So it is common. And so to my point, it's a gift that they have. And it's really, in a way, it's like, is it their fault? If it were a really bad thing, we'd say, well, it's not their fault. If it was a birth defect and they were born without one of their arms, we'd say, well, that's the way they were born. Someone like Bo Jackson was born with a great gift to use his body on the battlefield of sports. And it doesn't mean that he is a great person. He just used his gift. Unfortunately, in his case, he had a hip issue that kept him from reaching greater heights. And by all accounts, he seems like a pretty good dude, but I wouldn't go so far as to say Bo Jackson is like a great guy unless I met him and unless he was in my personal life. And so unfortunately, I do really like the lyrics that somebody I really can't stand wrote called My Hero. And Dave Grohl, I can't stand that guy, and I think he's part of the club. But, it's like, there goes my hero, he's ordinary, right? Those are the people, if it's just like the guy at the soup kitchen, or your dad, going to work and slaving away and like putting food on the family, as George Bush said, people in your life that have really great qualities, who have done great things for the betterment of their children, their families, and their community. Still, I wouldn't use the word worship, but those are the people we should be holding up and venerating. But that's not the world or the culture that is being promoted, unfortunately. And so we fall victim to that whole idea, and the media just amplifies that. We live in a hyper media environment, and now we don't just have 3 channels. Now we have basically limitless channels with social media and YouTube, and then all the cable channels and all the on-demand things. So introspection and discernment are called for at all times because of all the traps out there. And it just helps to kind of ask yourself, if you do want to make the most of your life and your gifts, am I investing my time in the most positive, constructive way? Or am I just tuning out because I'm really tired? And sometimes that's fine. You can tune out and just let yourself be entertained. But it does pay to remind yourself that you don't know these people. And so maybe we can just give an example or two of somebody we may have venerated or worshipped in the past that turned out to be just a complete lie, or a big disappointment, or maybe somebody, the corollary is also a possibility. Somebody you thought was really awful, and then you learned something about them that revealed that their persona or their image was not the truth, and that they're actually better, or way better than you ever expected. Yeah. Do you have any examples beyond
Well,
Chris Sky.
yeah, actually, so you brought up a great example, and it's not what I went into this particular episode thinking about, but I mean, Dave Grohl is a great example because I actually years ago was a Foo Fighters fan and obviously knew him from his drumming in Nirvana and held him as a very talented musician, and everything that I could see from a very arm's length point of view seemed like, oh, he seems like a cool guy and all that. And once I had dug deeper into the club, as we've talked about before, and of course there's that great 5-hour video that we've referenced before by Attillian Childs, and I took some of those snippets in the video that I made about the Masons, and I specifically put some of those clips from both Nirvana and Dave Grohl where they're doing many like 666 and like pentagram type of things, clearly honoring and showing who they hold their allegiance to, and Dave Grohl specifically. And then of course he was a big proponent of the jab back in 2021, and there's a lot of speculation that he forced Taylor Hawkins to do that, and that led to Taylor Hawkins' untimely demise. And I just now realize that particular character known as Dave Grohl is a very dark and twisted person, and I should have never really looked up to him. Talented, musically, probably. I can't discount some of the things that he's accomplished or people helped him accomplish, but man, that's not someone I would ever want to associate with, because he's dark in many ways, and just I look back and like somewhere in my closet I've got a Foo Fighters shirt, and I should probably just go burn it. But that you brought up a great example, and I can just say that from years ago, having looked up to him, and now I'm like, ugh, ick. Why did I ever think that guy was great?
And I hated to quote that song, but the lyrics stand, that's, I think it is a good example of like, you can have somebody who's not a good person do accomplish great things. You could have like Stephen King, by all accounts, is like this disgusting statist, okay, put it that way. Like he's the opposite of a freedom fighter. He wants government involvement in everything. Does the guy write amazing horror fiction? Is The Shining like the creepiest thing ever written? And so, yeah, the guy has a gift, but does that make him a good person? Well, obviously, I don't think he's a great person, because he's a statist and he wants the government involved in all sorts of people's lives in all sorts of ways. And so that's a good example. Dave Grohl wrote a really good line there, and I happen to quote it, but it doesn't mean I endorse the guy. And I think we've all learned those lessons. Like, I read the autobiography of Miles Davis. I think it was probably one of the earliest realizations that I had, that somebody can be great at what they do, but they can be a lousy human being. And he pretty much just outright admitted it in the book. He treated women really poorly. And, but some of them, he made some of the most moving and beautiful and groundbreaking music. And for that, he's a great musician, but I don't hold him up as a great person. My mom actually went to a concert or a performance by Miles Davis in New York City probably in the late 50s, early 60s, when he was at the height of his fame. And she said he ran out in the middle of that performance and never came back. And I think that actually showed up in his autobiography, because he had like a woman problem, and he went out onto the street to put her in her place or something like that, and never came back to that performance. I think my mom was actually at that performance. So there you go. Not the greatest guy, not my hero, but we can separate the art from the person, and that's all we need to do.
I agree, and the purpose of us giving examples here is not to judge others, because I can say, just as those people are just humans, I can say I've got my flaws, and there by the grace of God go I could have been dead or in really worse situations in my life, in many situations, and I was spared from that. And so this is more just for us to highlight that there's a lot of people who have been held in that upper echelon of someone's mind, and there's really no reason. But with that disclaimer along the jazz lines, and the reason I say there but by the grace of God go I, there's plenty of dumb things I've done in my life that I could have suffered much worse consequences for. And you know, Jaco Pastorius is known as like one of the greatest bass players of all time in the jazz world, and his character defect unfortunately led to his demise because he was very arrogant about his skills and had a big mouth. And the one particular show, his big mouth led to him being beat literally to death. And that's an example where someone starts to believe their own press and believe their talents so much that they believe they're superhuman and above other humans, and it gets them in trouble a lot. And whether it's running off stage dealing with women problems, or there's example from our generation of Axl Rose and all the issues he had with showing up to a gig on time and finishing it, or in the case of where I grew up in St. Louis, him stopping a show and pissing off a lot of people and leading to a riot. Like, there's a lot of people who, you know, on paper are talented, but they have, you know, issues like many of us do, and they let them get out of control a lot of times because they start believing that they are something special above others, and that leads to a lot of problems.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that we can touch on to kind of observe and tie this into maybe a greater pattern that we see is the whole building up of heroes and then the tearing down of heroes. And it's almost inevitable. It's that whole arc. It's like the Greek tragedy or something that we'll see that in the public realm. Somebody will be built up and they'll be promoted maybe out of nowhere, and then it's the whole straw man thing, or whether it's just like the need for a sacrifice or to protect other people in the club or whatever. But so many of these heroes will be taken down. They'll be destroyed in a very public manner, or they'll just be kind of disappeared, or their careers will be ruined. And now we have cancel culture on top of the usual ways to ruin someone's career. We're seeing it now with Sean Combs, Puff Daddy, otherwise known as P. Diddy. And I'm sure he's guilty of many heinous things, but I'm also pretty sure that he's being taken down to protect an entire network of other people that made it possible for him to do those heinous things and facilitated those things. And they're just protecting themselves. And I think when the FBI raids somebody like Diddy's residences and workplaces, what they're doing is not just finding evidence on him, they're destroying evidence that would implicate other people. And at the same time, they're holding on to evidence as compromat, as material to blackmail others. And so the ring just continues. But you can see that. I mean, the worship of P. Diddy was really high. I ran the New York City Marathon in 2003. And when Sean Combs happened to, I don't know what possessed him to do it, but he happened to run the marathon, the very same marathon that I ran. I only ran the New York Marathon once. And all of Upper Manhattan and Harlem came out because Puff Daddy was going to be running by, you know, a couple hours after I ran by probably. But actually, I think he turned in a respectable race. But I was like, I didn't even know who he was. They're just like, Diddy's coming, you know, that kind of thing. I'm just like, what is a Diddy? The little ditty about Jack and Diane, you know. I didn't know what a ditty was. But anyway, that whole aspect that heroes are propped up and then torn down, and in a way it's really not fair, you know. It's to the arc of a hero. In a way, it's that tragic arc that inevitably takes place because they are flawed in the end.
Yeah, and you also bring up a really good point. It was highlighted in a recent article by Agent 131711, and he's not the first to do a deep dive on the Royal Order of Jesters, which is one of the sub segments of the Masons, kind of a higher echelon, a notch, let's say horizontally and maybe vertically from like the Shriners. But anyway, in this particular article that he had published recently, he brought up that in some of the more headline worthy examples of people being busted doing heinous things under the banner of the Royal Order of Jesters. One of them was a Supreme Court justice, and the point was made, if they're letting a Supreme Court justice be busted, who is he protecting, or who is he taking the fall for, even higher above him? And I think along those same respects too, I think there is this aspect of sacrifices or being a good member of the team that many of our viewers will be familiar with the Black Eye Club. And I mean like getting punched in the eye, black eye, in case you maybe misheard me. There are many, many examples of famous people who have photos with, typically, I think it's their left eye being bruised from being punched. I don't think it's always the same eye, but I think there's a pattern there. But certainly there's a ritual that goes on where people are put back in their place, and perhaps those who start believing their own press a little bit too much are held out to be publicly humiliated as an example for others. One example from my point of view that I'm certain, I don't have evidence for it, but I'm certain that it was a public sacrifice, was Anthony Bourdain. And if you look at, I mean, he was a great chef, obviously, and a great orator. I mean, he had really good narrations in the shows he was in, and wrote a really hilarious book called Kitchen Confidential that I would recommend to anyone interested in being in the food industry. But, you know, he had his demons as well. He overcame drug addiction, and I think he had a lot of darkness. But that being said, the details related to his quote unquote suicide are sketchy at best. And anyone who knew him from as a TV personality knew better than he would not show up to go to a restaurant in Paris to hang out with his best friend, Eric Ripert. He wouldn't just suddenly commit suicide and not leave a detailed note like one of his episodes and with a long explanation of why he did it. But there are and I mentioned this recently in one of our episodes, there's a series by Mouthy Buddha called Pedogate, and he had shown how Anthony Bourdain was potentially somehow, if not intentionally, maybe got pulled into that whole ring of disgustingness. And who knows what he might have said or did, but he may have believed that he was impervious to being punished publicly. And not only did, you know, he die, but then I had seen many examples where CNN had brought him up numerous times. And I remember, like, maybe within the year of him dying, Dave Chappelle had done a comedy skit and started by basically mocking Anthony Bourdain. And to me, I feel like that's probably a dog whistle to other people in the club and who are famous. Like, if this happened to him, this can happen to you. And just making sure that whether it's Dave Chappelle, whether it's CNN specials, whether it's any number of ways that people don't forget that Anthony Bourdain died, and even if the general public doesn't realize that that was in fact a hit, the people who are in the club know what actually happened, and it's like, don't step out of line or this could be you.
Yeah, really good points on that. When you mentioned Anthony Bourdain, my mind went also to Chester Bennington of Linkin Park and Chris Cornell as well, Soundgarden and Audioslave, who were reportedly fed up by what they saw in the, you know, the whole celebrity world and the world of ritual abuse, and maybe wanted to do something about it, and something happened to them first. So we'll never know. But a lot of times where there's smoke, there's fire. So I looked into the death of Chris Cornell in particular and watched his final concert. And there's no indication that this is like a depressed guy who's going to go back to his hotel room and unalive himself afterwards. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the egregious human being that I used to look up to. So this is a little confession. So bless me, Father, for I have sinned. But I used to worship Bono and U2. So I am repenting publicly right now for all my U2 sins. But like I said, I can separate the music from the musician. And I mean, I know I can understand that U2 isn't everyone's cup of tea, especially the bombastic aspect of some of their music. But it meant a lot to me, and it sometimes still does resonate with me. But that's a great example of somebody that is a pompous ass spokesperson for the freaking New World Order. Like, there's never been an ass that Bono wouldn't kiss that's like in the club. You know, he hangs out with Klaus Schwab. He kisses the Pope's ring. He's probably had a Passover dinner with Netanyahu for all I know. But yeah, that's my confession. So I had to get that out. And so now I feel so much better, you know, having got that off my chest.
You know, along those lines, and he's definitely a member of the club. There's numerous photos of him, you know, showing his allegiance. But yeah, you name it, you know, vow of silence, the one eye, all of that. But, you know, just realizing that as I was putting together the video about the Masons, or really being reminded, I didn't need to be reminded. I mean, like you said, he's very public about supporting the one world government and everything involved in that, and the UN and all those particular players involved in quote unquote leadership. But I remember just knowing, even I think shortly after I'd woken up for the first time, that he was full of it, because he happened to be, well, U2 happened to be the planned performance during the halftime of that Super Bowl right after 9/11, and they had their big performance, and I could just tell he was phony, and I was like, there's something off about all of this. And then of course the Patriots won the Super Bowl in very questionable fashion, and that's where I also started going, wait a minute, I think a lot of these, especially the big events, are rigged. And of course it was rigged that the Patriots would win right after 9/11. And who would be the face of like rallying the people and saying, let's go do the next thing of the New World Order, but Bono himself. So I think all of that was appropriate and planned out, you know, years in advance.
Good point about that. And I think of all the sports, football is probably the easiest to fix. I always wonder why in 2001, after winning 2 World Series in a row, why didn't the Yankees win the third in a row against the Arizona Diamondbacks? Maybe it was an accident. Mariano Rivera didn't get the memo and he blew it. The Yankees were supposed to win, I think. But it's just, baseball is harder to fix than football. That's my takeaway from that one. Yeah.
That might be that might be a discussion for another time. I think there's nuance to every sport, but you know, just because you brought it up, could it be something to do with snakes, Lucifer, a serpent? Who knows? Like I can't pretend to know all the gematria and all the, you know, hidden meanings behind things, but I'm sure it was intentional. But the one that you have to like have fallen off a turnip truck and not have gone, wow, that's kind of interesting that the Patriots won right after 9/11, the same year they come up with the Patriot Act. Like, that was pretty much in your face, and it was, you know, get along with the program or else sort of thing. And of course, U2 and Bono were happy to be part of that spokesperson club to get people on board with the new program.
Yeah, definitely. Sports is a big part of it. It's all one piece. I think politics, entertainment, sports, movies, it's all one part of one control mechanism. And they're really just out to make good slaves. If you unthinkingly consume all of the things that you're given, first of all, you are just wasting your time because you're not investing in yourself. And then second of all, you're just being a good slave. So if that's your lot in life and that's what you're satisfied with, then that's fine. I think there is a time and a place and a role for people that they're NPCs. And really that's not said with any kind of malice at all when I say that. It's taken me a while to get to the point where there is no malice in my heart when I use that description, but I think it's a really apt description. Some people are just not meant to go beyond what they are programmed to do because they need to play a role in society, and society needs people to play certain roles. But for people to really reach their potential, they have to make conscious decisions about their own sovereignty, and they have to say no at certain junctures and not grant permission for all of these things to override who they are at every turn. And there comes a point where they need to just take control of their lives and their wheel, take control of the wheel, metaphorical, of what they're doing in their lives and actually accomplish something rather than consuming.
Well said. And I can't really add much more to that except to say that something we've repeated recently about, okay, so if you're aware of something and it bothers you, do you just sit there and black pill and let yourself go down a negative mental space and let it consume your energy, or do you activate and do something about it? And to me, I feel like this is a good point for me to also remind our viewers that we have some people who are very well known for their activism coming up in the next couple weeks, and they're great examples of, well, I know that there's this injustice or this wrong in the world, and I'm going to spend my energy to do something about it. So 100%, like there's so many things we can be doing to grow ourselves, to grow our talent, to contribute to the world in a meaningful way. And when you realize that some of these things that you're given to consume are really just time wasters to prevent you or slow you down from doing the things you really could do with the time that you have in this world. When you make that realization, it's powerful. And then you can decide what it is, what your piece of that puzzle will be. And it's not like you have to boil the ocean and do everything yourself, but you can make those one little step at a time. You can decide to say no to certain things, or you can raise awareness, or whatever your version of that is. But you can decide that I'm going to do something about it in my own way, in a way that I can do realistically. It's not saying that you have to quit your job or quit whatever it is that you do in life, but you can make your own waves and create a tidal storm by doing those little waves, one little one at a time. So that's just my closing thought. Stay tuned. We've got some really interesting folks who do activism, and they're going to talk about that in coming weeks.
Yeah, really looking forward to that. I think that's a direction that we've been really pointing towards from the very beginning of this podcast, is what do you do once you become aware of all the ways that the deck is seemingly stacked against us in this world, all the pitfalls that are laid out for us. And being aware of that is one thing, but then and not letting it get to you and drag you down and become too black-pilled to where you're paralyzed by it. The logical step is to take action. And so we're really looking forward to hearing from people that have really set that out for themselves to take action and learn from them about their stories and what they've been doing. So stay tuned for that in the next couple of weeks. We're taking it in a very exciting direction for sure.
Absolutely. And I've been doing it every week, and I'll continue to do it. Shout out to anyone who wants to come and tell their story, whether it's activism or just, their realizations about things, how they're reframing the narrative. We do want to hear from you. We'll continue to provide our contact information. Reach out. As we said before, we're just two normal guys having a chat, and you guys are listening to it. And if you want to be part of it, let us know. Until then, I would say, look out for episode 17 and beyond. We have a lot of exciting stuff coming your way soon.
Peace out.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.